Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
Welcome to the Center for Educational Media at Middle Tennessee State University. This is the SPED Collaborative Summer Academy. This is a conference for special education teachers, and we have topics today that have been requested by special education teachers and presenters who have been nominated by special education teachers. I'm also happy to say in the SPED Collaborative we have two important partnerships. One, we partner with 10CEC, which is the Council for Exceptional Children in Tennessee, the professional organization that supports the work of special education. We also partner with the Tennessee Department of Education, and we invite them every summer to present and do updates and present on topics that are happening in the department. And so, and we have a presenter today, Ms. Annika Chambers, who will be presenting from the Tennessee Department of Ed. Otherwise, we have a great session, a great day today, 4 sessions, and this is the first one. So I will introduce our first presenter, Ms. Annika Chambers from the Tennessee Department of Ed. Thank you for being here, and I will let her finish the introduction for herself. I'm so happy you're all here today.
It's right here. Perfect, thank you. All right. Hi, I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak to you guys today, and we're talking on something that's very near and dear to my heart. I've worked at the department for 7 years, but I was a teacher for 10. I have been a general ed teacher, but for the majority of my time, I was a special ed teacher. And of course, you know, that's where my heart is. I'm the academic intervention and enrichment coordinator for the special education programming team at the department. And it was something that we're doing this year, and started last year, we're continuing this year, is this idea of general and special education collaboration, and that we're not necessarily two different groups of people that are preparing units and lessons away from each other, but that we need to collaborate so that we're all on the same page, because both groups, both general and special ed, bring things to the table. Right? Those general ed teachers have a strong content knowledge. They're the ones that have really focused on understanding their content and being content experts. But special ed are those instructional strategies and being able to understand how our students that are struggling with their learning in the general ed classroom can access that learning, as well as how they express their learning. And of course, we do that through our IEPs. And so we're going to talk about access to core instruction, what are the ways that we can access instruction, and how can we use terminology between general education and special education that we all know, because sometimes general ed teachers have these terms that we've not heard because we might not necessarily been in the same training as them, and they don't know all of our terms in special ed because they haven't been in our trainings. And so we need to find a way to come together and be able to use the same terms, the same vocabulary, so that we're communicating in a really strong manner. So for access to core instruction, first I got to start with our department priorities, because this is something we always highlight. We have 3 areas that we really focus on at the department, and that is academics, educators, and student readiness. Special education, of course, focuses on all 3 of those. Of course, I am actually under academics specifically, and so that's what we're really focusing on today. The agenda is that we want you guys to be able to identify access points and scaffolds, and we're going to talk about what those terms mean from how the department defines them. And using high quality instructional materials, or what we call HQIM. You might have been hearing that term tossed around for the past couple years. Also, we want to make sure that we are able to not only differentiate accommodations and modifications ourselves, but how are we able to communicate that with our gen ed teachers, because they don't know the differences. And when you're in an IEP meeting and they're asking about a certain modification, they don't understand how that impacts a student down the line. And so we want to make sure we're able to communicate that. We also want to be able to identify the appropriate use of an accommodation and incorporate accommodations into instruction. And so I'm going to give you guys some strategies that you can share out with your gen ed teachers. And if you like what we do right here, I'm actually planning on trying to record this, and it's really going to be generated as being recorded towards gen ed teachers so that they feel comfortable and confident to reach out to you and have conversations around access. What is equity, and how do we ensure that this happens for all students? We always have to start with this, right? We have to remember the difference between everything being equal versus what equity is. And so we want to talk about the fact that equal means it's the same level of opportunity. It means everybody gets the exact same thing. Whereas equity is, depending on what the needs are, is what those levels of support should be. And so special education is really more along the lines of equity, right? We're talking about what supports are needed for a student who may struggle with access to their learning. And I really like this quote: educational equity means that every child receives whatever they need to develop their full academic and social potential and to thrive every day. Like, that's what we're really going for here, right? We want our students, our children, to be able to thrive in their daily life, not just in the classroom, but everywhere. So when we're talking about access to instruction, there are two things that we can focus on: strategies that support all students, because any student could be a struggling learner depending on what you're talking about. No student just knows everything. They all struggle with something, and so we need to be able to know that there are strategies that support all students. And then, of course, if we add in those accommodations and modifications, that's where we find access and participation instruction for our students with disabilities. And we believe at the department that all students should be engaged in grade level content, and that is of high quality for those standards. In order to ensure that, we want them to have access to grade level content by having strong core instruction. We want this to be inclusive of all of our learners, and that includes our students with disabilities. We want them to be in the general ed classroom as much as possible because they should be getting the same access to standard instruction. They should be having this, we should have the same expectation of them being able to know their standards and be successful with knowing standards. Because as we talk about all the time, they're general education students first. And general education is where we learn our standards. And so that's why it's a very big emphasis on our end. And that we have really started to emphasize high quality instructional materials, and we've done that a lot with the Reading 360. We've worked a lot with getting, new textbooks and having that kind of HQIM. They've now been doing that with the math, and so this is where we're talking about this HQIM has really come into place, and we're saying that our students with disabilities, even if you're not in the general education classroom for a class, you should still have access to those instructional materials, because all students should have access to that HQIM. And that they have multiple points of access so that all learners can maximize their grade level opportunities. So to improve those student outcomes and their future success in post-secondary opportunities, because ultimately what do we want? We want them to have every opportunity available to them when they graduate with us, right? Including those with unique learning needs need to have access to HQIM. So I've talked about access points, and that might not be something that you've necessarily heard that term thrown around. It's kind of something that we've shifted to over the past couple of years. And then you guys have done scaffolding for ages, but we have a specific definition that we use for it. So I just want to touch base on how we define these things as a department so that we're all on the same page here. Our access points are actually those things that you will find in the teacher editions of the curriculum, of the textbooks. So you know how like there's little call outs on the sides of the teacher editions where it tells you like, hey, consider doing a think-tac-toe, or consider having an additional level reader or something. They'll give you some kind of point. Those are access points. So the things that are already in the curriculum that give call outs of ways to access instruction. And then in addition to that are instructional scaffolds. And those are temporary, they're student specific, and they're a support structure designed to maximize that access. These two at the top are ones that we should be using for all learners. And if we do those well, it minimizes the need for the accommodations and modifications. So if we're doing what's right for all students by using access points and instructional scaffolds, then we've now minimized having, 15 accommodations on an IEP. We minimize that when we do those top ones. But I want to make sure that we are all on the same page of the difference between accommodations and modifications, and we are going to dig into this a little bit more. And accommodations and modifications are not just in an IEP. They're also in a 504, and they're also in an ILP. So this is something that you can also connect with your EL teachers with. But an accommodation is how the student accesses. We're asking to add something to their instruction to change how the student accesses their learning. But when we shift to modifications, we're changing what we expect them to learn. And when that happens, it starts limiting their opportunities after they graduate, after they leave us. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more. The greater access to flexibility in how that instruction is delivered, and the multiple options that we provide students to respond to that instruction, to demonstrate their knowledge, reduces the need for singling out individual students to provide accommodations. The more we provide better and greater access for all students, the less we have these lengthy IEPs, and it's truly about those things that close the gap with whatever their deficit is. So access points, I just wanted to give you an example. Again, it says annotations, and this right here is just a screenshot of a lesson where it has these things on the side that show, meeting students' needs. Those are examples of access points, those call outs that you'll see in the teacher edition. Now, we've been working with this thing called Access for All Learning Network, it's AALN, and we have quite a few districts that have now joined in. We have 2 cohorts. Our second cohort just did their summer summit the past 3 days. And our focus really is on that collaboration and access to core instruction, not just for our students to have access to HQIM, but our special education teachers to have access to those teacher editions. And something that our districts have discovered as they've met together as general and special education leadership is that not all of our special ed teachers necessarily have access to a teacher edition. And so if you don't have that, then please reach out to your special ed supervisor and say, hey, may I get access? Because that's where those great conversations can start, because you need to have the same thing as your general ed teacher to have that collaboration really, truly happen. So those are things that, can be provided that help you have better and greater conversations. So again, we're going to break down this definition of instructional scaffolding. The structure. This is the support structure, and it can take a lot of forms. It could be a tool. It could be something like a graphic organizer. We do those all the time. And that's something that your gen ed teachers already are aware of. We all love graphic organizers. They're wonderful visuals to have. But they might not think about the fact that not everybody has to use the exact same graphic organizer. Why not let the student choose what graphic organizer they use to show how they connect and chunk their content together, their understanding of things, right? Because it would show you that A, they understand how they're chunking things and that they might actually understand it better than you thought, and B, it gives you insight into how that student thinks. Does that mean that their graphic organizer is wrong? A lot of times graphic organizers just is how we are telling them we chunk the information. So why not think about how we offer graphic organizers and let the student choose what way they want to chunk that information? These are things that we think of that our gen ed teachers might not, because they have this, we have to get this done, I have a whole class here, but that's a very quick student choice that they might not have thought of, that if you're collaborating with them, it would have come up, right? Having peer interactions, teacher interactions, making sure that we're not just, saying, oh, you're special education, so I'm going to let your special ed teacher talk to you or give you that feedback. They're a student in your class, and then they need to be able to those general teachers need to feel comfortable talking to all the students in the class and giving feedback and understanding that the student that has an IEP still should have the same expectations of learning, and so you should still be having those conversations with them. And exercises. So those are some of the more forms that your structure of scaffolding could take place in. Student specific. We talk about it all the time, data, 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 right? We need evidence that tells us who needs scaffolds and when. And that's not just, again, that's not just for our students with disabilities, it's for any student. And you know what? That might not be something where you have to pull out your screeners and go, oh, I'm gonna let me group this way. That could be a quick formative, one of those thumbs up, thumbs down. It could be having a quick exit ticket that tells you who you need to better support with a scaffold when you do a reteach of the content the next time you turn it around. So it's student specific. Now, it could be applied to whole group. So if you do an exit ticket and all of the students in that class clearly did not understand what just happened, then you know what? You're having a scaffold for the entire class. But your data told you that, because data isn't necessarily a number. There is qualitative data too, and that is just as important. So I'm gonna stop for a second here because I wanna talk about qualitative data. And I think that this is something where we don't necessarily feel as confident in being able to speak up with this. Our IEPs, when we talk about having data in the present levels, right? That, yes, should have numerical data. We do need that because it's objective, but you guys are the professionals. You and the general ed teachers are the professionals in that room, in that meeting. Your observations, your narrative, you're taking what you saw with formatives and being able to take that in and give a summary of what you've observed. That is important. That narrative is important and really does impact what you guys should be deciding on for present levels. And not just for you guys as special ed teachers, but the gen ed teachers too. And that's one of the things we're trying to help encourage, is that gen ed teachers feel comfortable and confident in speaking up in IEP meetings about what they're seeing in the classroom. But if the students aren't in the classroom, then they can't really speak up on it. So we're trying to get them in there too. All right, temporary. We shouldn't be doing this over and over again forever. We're trying to be able to build them to a place where those skills, that gap is closed for them, and then we can take away that scaffold. So it's the same thing as we talk about with accommodations. We shouldn't be sitting with the same accommodations for year in, year out, every year. We shouldn't be adding and adding accommodations. We should be closing gaps so that those accommodations can be taken away. So it's all about what we talked about when I was teaching. What we always told parents was, we're trying to work ourselves out of a job, right? We're trying to close those gaps. There will always be students who have a need, but if we're doing our job well, we're closing gaps and moving kids away from special ed, back into RTI, back into gen ed. And so the same thing happens when we talk about instruction. It's temporary, and we should be using it until we can pull it away. We can minimize, we can stop using it as much and pulling it back. And you guys, as special ed, know scaffolding really, really well. All right, it should be grade level. When we're talking about this, again, we want to make sure we're keeping those same expectations and staying within the idea of grade level. And that's not just for students with disabilities. This whole scaffolding idea is for all students. But sometimes we start doing things like this and we start losing the expectation for all the students in the classroom to meet a higher level of expectation. And it's meant to maximize that access. This is so that we grapple productively. And I love that phrase, because we're not here to just ensure that a student gets an A in a class. That's not the goal. The goal is for them to learn, and we don't tend to learn something unless we've struggled with it. Like when you've struggled with something, that's what sticks with you once you found that success. And so what we're trying to do here is not necessarily just make it easy on a student. That's not what a scaffold is for. That's not what an accommodation is for. It's meant to provide the opportunity for them to struggle and learn. So we have a couple of things. Now this protocol is specific to literacy, but it can be adapted for whatever subject areas. But we have what we call a unit prep and a lesson prep protocol. And it's meant to help with those conversations for collaboration between our general and special ed, and for just our general teachers, even if they're just using this on their own, this helps them collaborate, but bringing you into this conversation makes this even more effective, so to speak, and it gives it depth. And so these protocols are a great way to start with better collaboration and having something to center your conversations around as you're getting comfortable having those conversations. But within this, it's meant to identify access points that are in the curriculum. It's meant to identify scaffolds. Also, what are those grade level expectations? So that the whole grade level with that subject area knows what should our exemplar be? What should we be looking for with our expectation for all students to complete a task? What are the prereq knowledge that they need? And what content might they need that requires scaffold for access? So these questions are embedded within the unit and lesson prep protocol. Let's talk about how we're supporting our gen ed teachers. Again, want to remind ourselves, accommodations, how the student accesses information, accommodations does that, modifications changes what we expect. And this is a phrase that is commonly known across special education in general, but you will see this like 2 or 3 times in this presentation because it is so very important. The least dangerous assumption. And that is that students are able to participate within core instruction without any accommodations or modifications unless there's substantial student performance and data indicating otherwise. So when we sit in an IEP meeting, we should start with the assumption that they are able to access that curriculum without anything, and then we turn and look at that present levels and start looking at where did we really see data that said that they are exceptional and truly need an accommodation or modification based on what we discussed with present levels. We should be using that to determine what accommodations, not what's worked for them in the past. Let's look at what's in front of us now. So here are some things that accommodations should or shouldn't do. And now that you guys will have this presentation, please feel free to share these slides with your gen ed teachers so that they feel comfortable talking about this in the IEP meeting. They should be having these conversations. They feel confident saying, I feel that this accommodation, based on what we see as a need, that this accommodation would be very powerful, but them understanding the difference of what an accommodation should and shouldn't do will help them feel more confident in actually speaking up of what they think they need. So accommodations should enable our students to participate fully. It's based on the individual need, not on a category, not on a label. It's aligned with the daily instruction. That right there, that line right there is why your gen ed teachers need to be speaking up during accommodation conversations, because it is aligned with their instruction and they are the ones that know what's happening in their classroom. It's provided on a daily basis during instruction. It fosters independence for the student, not dependence, right? Talking about we're not enabling students to just make an A. We're looking for that productive grappling, right? And then it provides access, not advantage. It's meant to make sure that our students with disabilities have the same opportunity to learn as our general ed students who do not have an IEP. They should not remove content or standards. They should not eliminate participation or opportunities within gen ed. They should not be introduced only for high stakes testing. If you don't need it in the general ed classroom, then you don't need it for your high stakes testing. You don't need it for testing as well. It should be about that daily instruction. If you can access the learning there and you have an accommodation there that you need to access the test that's allowed, then that's great. But it shouldn't just be something that we just do it for here, because that's where we go back to providing advantage over access, and that's not appropriate. And it should not be provided solely as a way to help ensure proficiency. Again, it's not about giving a student an A or even getting them to pass. It's about providing the access to learning. So some considerations for us to make sure we keep in mind, and again, another slide that'd be great for you guys to share with your gen ed teachers. Expect that all students can achieve grade level standards. Because quite often I found and I discovered when I was teaching is if I had an expectation, kids will meet that. Whatever bar you set, that's what they're going for. And if your bar's down here, then that's about as close as you're gonna get. But if your bar's up here, even if they don't hit it, they're gonna come a lot closer here than when your bar was down here. They would be here as opposed to, well, here's my bar and here's where they ended up. If my bar's up here, even if they don't achieve this, they're gonna be up here, and this huge gap has been closed that we didn't even realize that we placed on that. And so we have to step back and make sure, what are we expecting of these students? Am I setting a low bar? And when we realize that we need to have those same high expectations, they will strive for those. We want to make sure that we review their strengths, review the present levels, and I apologize, I missed changing this title. I know that we have now, I don't know if you guys have had a chance to go into the new platform, and I know we're not going to be able to discuss that here today because we've got a lot more to go over, but we have changed the name of the present levels to adjust to align with IDEA, and so it's now called the present levels of academic and achievement performance, the functional performance. And those are called the PLAFs. And so that's the official name of it from the IDEA, and so that's why we changed the name of it. But it's present levels. The whole thing starts with the same title of present levels, and so just the name changed, but the purpose did not. But we should be reviewing the PLAFs and whatever goals you determine are needed to close gaps based on those PLAFs. We need to identify the barriers to access for that student, and then select those accommodations as a team based on their current needs. And so a lot of times we do our IEPs later in the year, getting ready for the next year, and oftentimes I have seen IEPs that have maybe just the screener data from fall, but you have at least fall, winter, and you probably have your spring at that point. Why not have all 3 pieces of data and see how they were doing with that? Take your progress monitoring that you've been doing all year with those goals, use that data in there too. How have they been doing? Where are there places that we still need to close gaps? And use that data to also help you understand those current needs, because that's the current work, right? The things that you're doing this year to help understand what support they need. And again, we're saying accommodations should provide access so the student can accurately reflect their current level of knowledge and mastery. That's just a nice fancier way of saying what we've been talking about, right? It's about them being able to access learning and express their learning. And administering accommodations during instruction assessment as appropriate, and evaluate and improve accommodation use by talking to the student. How often have you had a student that had an accommodation they refused to use? Right? Like all the time. I struggled with, I felt like it was such a distraction. I had a student one year that had a read aloud accommodation that did not like to listen to the read aloud, and I felt like that's such a distraction for them to focus on their assessment, and I worried that that impacted their actual score because read aloud wasn't something that they used, and they didn't use it all year, like, you know, and so it's where we need to start saying, hey parent, let's have a quick meeting and let's talk about what what your student is using for their accommodations, and let's ask the student. Let's ask the student, why do you not like to use this accommodation? Is there a way for them to feel comfortable with the accommodation? Or is the student really going to be able to tell us, that is not something that helps me, it actually distracts me? And when you do that, the parent's hearing it from the student, and it helps kind of give the parent a little bit different of perspective. It's not about the parent and the teacher having this big conversation about whether or not that we feel it's needed, because if there's a disagreement there, oftentimes, you know, it's a very pressure situation, right? Let's ask the student, because they're going to help you clarify that with the parent, and that's going to help you understand the student as well. So as many times as we can, having the student in the meeting, especially at least to talk about what helps them in the classroom, that is data that helps you too. Let's see here. So some considerations for accommodation selection. So 4 areas that we need to think about as we consider accommodation selection. How are the materials presented? Is there an accommodation that is needed to have the material presented in a way that helps that student access it better? Again, like we just talked about, read aloud, but It could be something as simple as a student needs large print, or maybe they need Braille. Maybe they need to have that pre-teach vocabulary, or maybe they need an AT device. You know, those are the things to think about. How are they presenting those? How the student responds, again, another AT device, that could be a place where they respond differently. It could be that they need to dictate to a scribe. It could be that we let them orally tell us an answer when possible, right? And so that's the how part. What is the setting? Is there something about a classroom that they need some different access? And we're going to give an example in there in a second. But do they need a table versus a desk? Because they spread out a lot, right? We have those students that like to have that elbow room. Are the lights too bright in a regular classroom? Is there something we can do to dim that for that student, but not to be so dim as to hurt the access of all the other students, right? The test in a small group setting, do they need to be pulled out for that focus? What are potential changes for timing and schedule? Is there a time of the day that student is way more alert and would be a better opportunity, a better time for them to be taking in instruction of a certain subject area, right? Like, so if I know I'm not a morning person, so this is perky me in the morning. But I'm more of an afternoon person. So if I'm struggling, say I was struggling in language arts, the afternoon after lunch is actually the best time for me. So if I could have had language arts in the afternoon, I would have had better focus, right? So we need to know our students well enough to know, is there something that would be better for a student for that? Or do they need a specific structure and we need to have maybe a visual schedule for them so they know their structure for the day, and we need to maintain that structure as much as possible, because when you knock them off their routine, there's a breakdown, there's a meltdown, right? And so we need to know those things and what can we do to accommodate for that. And then modifications. This is where we try our absolute hardest not to give modifications unless we absolutely must, right? They are restrictive by nature and they should be your absolute last resort. This is why we want our gen ed teachers to understand this, because this is very powerful information and this impacts a student's future. No matter what grade level we're talking about. You do modifications in elementary school, it impacts their ability to graduate with a gen ed diploma. When we change what students taught over long term, the opportunity to graduate is impacted. It further limits their employment and their opportunities for schooling past high school. And this is why we want to again remind everybody about that least dangerous assumption. We have to start with that least dangerous assumption so we're not putting in modifications that limit the student's ability to do things after school. So let's talk about this impact. The state standards define our expected learning, right, for each grade level. When we change the expectation, it's reduced. So if we start here earlier on in school and we've had these modified expectations, well, everybody else is on this green grade level, but our modified expectations have now put them at this angle, and look at how this is gapped. We've now created a gap because we've modified earlier on. And this is a better example because we can show it with the grade levels. Look at the gap between your expected student growth for all students versus the trajectory for modifications. When we change modification, and when we do this earlier, and you notice we start this at the kindergarten because we see students having modifications in kindergarten. And not only do our teachers that are in those earlier grade levels not necessarily know that that's going to impact them all the way through 12th grade, our parents don't understand that, and we have to be able to explain that to them early on, because we have parents and students in their high school years being told, I'm sorry, but you can't earn a general ed diploma because you don't have the skill set to take those classes and pass. Because your expectations brought this huge gap. So by the time you get to 9th grade, you're in a place where you can't. We need to be able to tell parents that. So when parents want modifications, we can have this conversation. You can use this chart if you want. Like, show them how it makes a difference when you make a modification selection, because it's going to help us decide, okay, is there a way for us to provide an accommodation that is a better fit versus changing expectations? as much as possible. Now, am I saying that we don't do this at all? No, there are students that this is appropriate, right? And that's okay. But we want to make sure we're not doing this as much as possible. All right, quick activity. You guys can do this on your own, or if you're sitting with somebody, or if you're on your own, you want to join somebody, go for it. Real quick activity. We have some things up here, and I want you to rank them from the least restrictive to the most restrictive. So as a partnership by yourself, however you want to do it, think through these and have, like, if you have a piece of paper, write down least restrictive to most restrictive. All right, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to have that conversation and come up with a list together. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and guess that no two lists are the same. Because, and I'll tell you, I have never been in a place where any of the lists were the same for any group whatsoever, because there's an interpretation to what an accommodation or modification is. It's how you apply it, right? Like, we were just talking about this, and we're going to touch base on it. But it's about how you apply it, right? So I'm gonna ask you, since I was just talking with you, what is the least restrictive thing that you put on your list?
We kind of divided them into categories, like, because they didn't seem super restrictive, but we talked about just like lighting is not that restrictive.
Okay. How many of you guys had lighting in your top 3? All right, a couple people back here, right? So lighting, that's just something, is that really restricting anybody's ability to do the work? No, absolutely not. I think I probably saw a calculator on some people's, right? So it's not necessarily considered restrictive if we're using it for the problem solving, right? We're not looking to actually see how they perform with calculation. If you're looking to perform calculations and you're trying to see how they calculate, that has now become a modification, hasn't it? So how we apply something determines how it's an accommodation or even a modification, or how restrictive even within, right? So I'm going to take back what we talked about there with we were discussing the shortened assignments. How you do a shortened assignment can make the difference between an accommodation and modification. Now, very often when we have handouts, you tend to make it very easy, not you, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say it that way. We tend to make it easy and be like, oh, let's just do all the odds or let's do all the evens. But if we do that, we are often cutting out the expectations of being able to show all of the skills that that handout had. Because quite often, the first half is one section and the bottom half is another section, and you might actually be missing some things. If you say just do the first half, you've cut out the entire bottom half expectations. So it's about understanding how you're shortening the assignments. If it's an accommodation, we need to ensure that how we're shortening that assignment does not exclude them from actually showing their ability to answer all of the skills that are required on that worksheet. But if it's a modification, then yeah, we might have them just do the top half because that's the part that we're focusing on with that student. But we have to know that, and our teachers, our gen ed teachers don't know that. They don't know the difference in a shortened assignment. They're just going to be like, oh, let's just do the half, or let's just do all the odds, and they don't know the intention of how to shorten an assignment, right? And so this is where it's a really great conversation. This is why we need to collaborate with our gen ed peers so that we're on the same page of what that shortened assignment should look like, because it's an accommodation, so that we're doing what's best for that student in terms of our expectations, right? What were some other ones that you guys had in your least restrictive? What'd you have?
We had repeat directions, because that's something we just do normally.
We do that for any kid, right? And if you already have a teacher that's doing, like, you know that all of your teachers in the building do that, it doesn't even have to be an accommodation because it's offered to all students anyways, right? If it's something you're already offering to all students, not a problem. All right, what's another one that you guys had for a least restrictive? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about that. Yes, she said, what did you say again? Let me make sure I say it out loud for us. What was yours again?
I said repeat direction.
Repeating directions. Repeating directions was the first one. So I apologize for that recording piece. Another one. Any other least restrictive? What about most restrictive? Oh, did you have a least restrictive? Yeah, there we go.
Frequent breaks.
Frequent breaks. That's not a hard thing for us to do. It doesn't change their learning, right? Frequent breaks is a nice one that, shoot, any kid could use. Heck, we could use it. Sometimes we need some frequent breaks. How often is it that you don't have a restroom break the whole day? You know, even at your lunchtime because you have 15 minutes to eat and get back with your kids. You know, I mean, frequent breaks is something that does not change the expectation. It doesn't hamper their ability to learn. That's a nice least restrictive one. Okay, let's shift over. What did you think was the most restrictive thing on here? Most restrictive. What was the thing at the bottom of your list that you said was most restrictive? So she said scribe. Now, I would love for us to get that mic because I want to ask you why you think scribe is the most restrictive. And I have an idea of why I think it's very restrictive, but I want to hear your ideas.
I was just thinking impact to the classroom, especially if a scribe is like, you know, thinking about testing, we have to have someone with that person. And it's kind of what you said in the beginning, it's how you think about all these things. Because like with frequent breaks, if that means a break outside of the classroom, then that can get more restrictive too.
That's
because,
true.
and maybe that's more the sensory, but it's again, just how but I don't see scribe a lot. So I thought of that one as one of the more restrictive.
Excellent point. And you're right, like that really is a very restrictive thing. And we consider that very restrictive, even if it's just to access the information and have that teacher help. But when you have a teacher with a student all the time, are their peers going to come over and interact? We've restricted their ability to have that socialization too. And so that is a big thing with what we worry about when we have a one-on-one aide or having a scribe. That student is now reliant with the scribe. They are reliant on another person to complete their activities. And that makes it very restrictive. So excellent point.
And I imagine with technology, there's probably a way to have a scribe where it is less intrusive these days. But when I think of scribe and what I've seen in the schools, it's someone there beside them.
When we're
writing
talking
down.
about another person assisting a student and that student in needing that, it is very restrictive for them. Excellent point. Anybody else have something that was really restrictive in their minds? All right.
I think they actually go together, read aloud or oral testing.
Right. First off, you have to be pulled out of class because it's distracting the other students, right? And again, you're relying on somebody else to help you with that. And so you aren't able to do that independently. I like to think of how much of the student's independence has been taken away, and that to me feels very restrictive. So for me, when I think of restriction, I think of I've limited expectations or I've taken away independence, right? So that's how I visually like to think about it when I look at that. That's an excellent point. All right, it feels like you guys really thought about these and thought about how we intend to use them. And that's exactly what this activity is about, is that we have to know how that accommodation was, why that accommodation was chosen, what was the intention of it, and in order to know that intention, we need to have that real strong PLAF, that present levels, that tell us what's going on with a student and why would somebody choose that accommodation, right? And then being able to vocalize that with our gen ed teachers, the ones that should be doing these things to implement in their classroom. All right, so we're gonna do a quick little recap here. Which one provides access to instruction and assessment, accommodation or modification? Just out loud. Which one of these is it? It goes under accommodations? That is correct. What about it changes the learning expectations, both of what is taught and what is expected? That's right. We're going to have a tricky one in here, I promise. They do not ensure proficiency on assessments. Which one? Let's see here. There you go. It does not disqualify access and participation within core instruction. I have one person saying accommodations. Anybody have something different? You think modifications? We're going to put it over here. But accommodations, it does not disqualify them either. But because modifications are so restrictive, we wanted to make sure we emphasize that when you have a modification, it does not disqualify your access. So while you're correct, we emphasize it over in the modifications area. Having a long-term impact on the opportunities a student can access during and beyond school. That's right. Which ones are needed for access both for classroom and on assessments? Yeah, really those accommodations, because we can't do modifications on a test, can we? All right. We do not reduce the learning expectations. Accommodations. And our last one, I mean, we've now just given it away, but it's highly restrictive. It should be used as a last resort, and that is, of course, an accommodation. All right, and again, I told you we were going to put it up here again because it is so important, that least dangerous assumption. All right, so how do teachers implement accommodations? So here's some steps that you can know to support these teachers, as well as these are steps that you can share with your gen ed teachers so that they feel comfortable and confident with accommodations. All right, steps to implementing accommodations. Teachers are required to provide them. Not just us, any teacher who has the student in their classroom, as outlined by their IEP. So we want to make sure that they become familiar with each student's accommodations, they plan to implement those accommodations, that they collaborate and communicate, and that we're continuous learners. So how do we become familiar with each student's accommodations? We need to know the student's strengths and weaknesses. We need to ask questions to learn why behind the accommodations about what we just talked about. We need to be able to review the student's IEP or 504, and we need to talk to the child, their parents, and their special ed teachers. Now I'm going to talk about this for a second because I actually had a conversation with a special ed supervisor yesterday around reviewing an IEP. Because we were talking about the fact that we're talking about the IEP at a glance, because that's generally what we give our gen ed teachers. But truly, the gen ed teachers should be reading the entire IEP at the beginning of the year, because that paints the picture and understanding of each student. I was required, even when I was a gen ed teacher for my students, I was required to read all of those, and I was very happy I did because it helped me understand what I was reading on the IEP at a glance. So I had the IEP at a glance to refer to when I was in my classroom, but I knew what that meant because I'd read the entire IEP. That makes a huge difference in how we understand our students. And when I say our students, I'm talking gen ed and special ed, right? Because we inherit students each year, and you did not necessarily write the IEP. You guys are automatically, that's what you do. But our gen ed teachers aren't aware that they are allowed to read the whole IEP, and they should, because it helps them to better understand those students. All right, so we're going to start with the why. As classroom teachers, knowing the why is a key step. And here are some ways to find the why. Read through the full IEP. Read the prior written notice, that summary of how we made these decisions. Ask the case manager for more information. I don't think our gen ed teachers feel comfortable or know that they can. They might not feel like they're allowed to, because sometimes there's like this veil or wall between special ed and gen ed. We got to break that down and let them feel comfortable coming and asking when they're not sure of something. All right, so we're going to do another quick activity. You guys can do this as a group again. Each of these students have the same accommodation. It's preferential seating. But where would you place each of these students in the classroom? So our Sally, she has ADHD. We know that we have these students that struggle to sit at their desk. She focuses better when she can just be standing. Ethan, he struggles to copy from the board, and he also needs redirection. But Lucy, she just likes to socialize, I am probably Lucy. Like, I probably described myself for this one. She likes to socialize, and she's a distraction to herself and others. I was called a social butterfly by my first grade teacher. I'm Lucy. Let's just go ahead and tell you. I'm just going to be honest. But where would we put these 3 students in the classroom? Are we putting them in the same place? No. So at your groups, again, talk about where you would place each of them in your classroom. All right, so let's talk Sally for a second here. Where would you put Sally in the classroom? Raise your hand if you want to tell us where you put Sally in the classroom. Who's gonna tell us where Sally goes? Okay, you're gonna tell us up here. Hang on, we're gonna get that mic up here.
Decided we would put her in the back where she could have some free movement and not distract other students.
Right, putting her in the back for that. And even maybe, like, is there an opportunity for a standing desk there? That would be nice, right? Having something for that. And now we didn't talk about Sally being somebody who like has to move around back there either, but what if she is? What if she's the one that has to wander? What else could we do for a student that we're putting in the back of the room so they have all this space and they're like, oh, I'm gonna wander around. What else would we do there?
An area.
A taped off area for them too. Yeah, so let's think about what else could we think about when we're having those IEP conversations and we're saying, oh, we need to put her in preferential seating, and really that's going to look like the back of the room for her. Well, in the back of the room, there's a lot more space. Let's also talk about how we're going to have that taped off area too. And so having that in the IEP also helps define where we intended for her to sit. Excellent one. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk. I'm not going to say everybody. Did anybody have Sally in a different place than the back of the room? It feels like a really comfortable place, right? Hang on a second. I think we've got somebody back here for Sally.
Because we also want her to be a part of the class and the discussions and things going on. So maybe she has a desk within the group when they're doing group work that she can go back and forth to and just have that privilege. So still in the back for her stand up, but we also don't want her to be ostracized from the rest of the group. So we would like for her to have a desk within the group as well.
That's nice. I like that. It's speaking a little bit more outside of what we've done traditionally. And you wanted to skip to a different student?
Oh, I thought I was saying, or were we only talking about Sally at this time?
Yeah, well, I'm about to shift to Ethan though. All right. All right. So now we have Ethan, and somebody asked a great question over here. They're like, why does Ethan struggle? Like, what's the reasoning behind that? And so I shared, when I wrote this, my intention was that Ethan struggles to take something that's on the board and put it onto paper. Does that change how you would consider where you put Ethan? Because he also needs that redirection. So I'm going to ask, where would you put Ethan? Where would you put Ethan in the classroom? Anybody? Yes. Hang on, she's going to bring that to you.
We would put him front and center, closest to like the teacher's desk.
Okay.
That way it would be easy for him to transcribe whatever is on the board to his paper. And then if he needed redirection because he is getting distracted from what is around him, he could have that constant redirection from either his teacher or peers that are around him that could help him and say, hey, you need to stay on task.
And I love that you're pointing out that redirection doesn't necessarily have to happen by the teacher. Like, our peers can do that too. Excellent point. And somebody else had mentioned something. Can I pick on you for a second? Because you had mentioned something. And I want you to share. Oh, she already got that. Share what we talked about.
Well, we just talked about adding another accommodation, because if he's struggling to copy, no place in the classroom is really going to help that unless it's just a word or two. So providing that accommodation if he gets a copy of the notes or he gets to fill in the blank or something like that. So he's able to still be engaged, but doesn't have all that. He's they spend so much time trying to focus on what they're writing that they're not hearing the instruction. Was that what you wanted me to share?
Yes,
Okay.
that's what we talked about.
So adding another accommodation based on that.
Depending on what my attention was, right, what Ethan's real struggle is, that really doesn't change the purpose of his preferential seating. But if it was a visual thing, then at that front of the room, which you didn't know what I was intending with it, right? That front of the room makes sense. It's all in how we interpret the accommodation, and so we need to be able to explain why the accommodation was chosen, right? And the thing about this with the redirection, I love what you said about, having that peer redirection close to the teacher's desk, right? Close to where that teacher's gonna be. It's gonna depend on the teacher as to where that's actually gonna be the best place, right? I didn't have an actual teacher desk in my room because it was a waste of my space. And so I just had a table in the center of the room next to my projector. If I needed to sit down, that's where I was. So for me, it would be that center. They'd still be close to peers, but mine wouldn't be towards the front because I was never at the front of my room, And so it really needing to know how that teacher teaches as to where that redirection will be best for that student. And so knowing that the preferential seating is based on the redirection, that teacher needs to inform where that student is. So a lot of our gen ed teachers don't know that preferential seating just doesn't mean the front or the back of the room. It's intended, right, for what their needs are, and preferential seating isn't literally one place or the other, but with whatever intentionally best for that student. All right, so Lucy, Lucy likes to talk. Clearly, I like to talk, right? I'm up here chatting. Where would you guys put Lucy? I get pretty much one of two answers all the time. And I agree with them, but I'm curious, where would you put Lucy? We try by the wall, but that doesn't always work. Okay.
I was more focused on giving Lucy a job, a purpose in the classroom. So maybe she's the one that takes the good notes for Ethan.
Oh, you put them all in the same classroom. I love that.
But also, I struggle a little bit with having students redirect other students in the class who get distracted. What I've seen sometimes is that you have the really good student who would need to do the enrichment activities to, just excel even more. Sometimes gets put with the student who's struggling. And so they're more focused on that student's learning, not their own. So I think there's a delicate balance there when we're thinking about that kind of placement.
And I think, and when I'm interpreting redirection, I'm not interpreting it as I need to redirect you and work alongside, but more of, or a visual, or some kind of either a hand gesture or a word, or just some kind of quick redirect. And it really depends on the teacher's classroom and how their environment, how that classroom culture is, as to how that could look, right? In my classroom, my students knew that they were totally cool. It was totally cool. Like it didn't, and I didn't have, a lot of, I didn't generally have a lot of the higher learners because I had been a special ed teacher, so they put a lot of the lower learners in my class, right? And so I had a lot of other students, but they all knew my expectation. And so if a student next to them was being distracted, they'd be like, hey, get on task. And they move on to their work. And that was totally fine. That was allowable. They knew that I was fine with that. Now, if a student stopped and started helping the student do their work, I'd be like, hey, hello, let's remind ourselves of our culture in here. You have your own responsibilities, and so do they, right? It's how you establish that, right? And I think that's something that we can also have those conversations about with our gen ed teachers. Yeah. All right. So when we start with the why, if a student has that preferential seating, the accommodation is vague. A lot of our accommodations are actually very vague, and we don't think about it because we just have this natural habit of what we think it is, right? And it's something we've done for years, and so we just keep continuing to do it without thinking about the application. Knowing the why ensures the accommodation is appropriately implemented, and that's something our gen ed teachers need to understand. So it might mean that student's easily distracted and needs to be up front. It might mean that student fidgets, and so they're known to disrupt peers. Their seating can be strategic. Honestly, if I was Lucy, I'd be putting her to the side. Not to the back or to the front, but to the side. So I have a visual on her, but B, she's also limiting the amount of people that she can distract if it's a problem, right? But that's just me, like that's how my classroom would look. The student may need frequent standing breaks, need to have the side of the back so that they're minimizing distractions too. So planning to implement the accommodations. Here are some steps that we share with our gen ed teachers. I've actually used this training with gen ed teachers, and it's a great way for them to feel comfortable and confident with accommodations. Learning about the accommodations or their needs. So it's not necessarily just the accommodations, but if there's equipment involved, nobody showed me how to use equipment. It'd be nice to be able to be more comfortable knowing a student's equipment so that they're not constantly saying, this kid can't be in my classroom because I can't troubleshoot with this. So having our gen ed teachers comfortable with the equipment is also another thing that helps that access. Creating that classroom environment, we just talked about that, right? Your expectations, that culture of learning that's in your classroom makes a difference in how you support students and the use of those accommodations. Allowing our students time to practice new accommodations. I never really thought about this, and I feel bad about it now that I'm not teaching, because I'm like, man, that's something I should have thought about, is allowing some time for a student who's gotten a new accommodation to understand how that accommodation helps them and how they should be utilizing it. And I think that sometimes we don't necessarily talk about what that accommodation looks like for the student. They don't necessarily understand their own accommodations, right? And so letting them time to do that and using it, I think a great time, again, beginning of the year is the best time to implement a new accommodation, because you're reviewing what you've already done previously before you get started on the new stuff. So they're already using familiar content. We're not really, getting into anything new, and that's a great chance for them to practice a new accommodation. Being aware that students using accommodations might require more or less time to complete an instructional task. This is just a straight up bullet point that I wish our gen ed teacher truly understood. An accommodation might actually hinder their ability to finish the task in the time frame that you originally established for all your students. So they might actually need 5 or 10 more minutes, right? Recognizing the changing demands throughout the day, that the student might need a different accommodation in one setting versus another. Being aware of how that student perceives the accommodation. Again, this is why we want our students to be in there and talk about these in their IEP. We want to hear their perspective. And we need to be able to know that if they have a perspective that doesn't really align with what we know this is meant to be, that's our opportunity to explain it to them. Monitoring the student's progress regularly, because needs can change over time. You do not have to just choose accommodations for 1 year and they have to stick with it all year. If an accommodation is no longer needed, have a meeting. You can do an amendment, go for it. That's okay, and that's a great thing. It means that you have now closed something, that you have now scaffolded out an accommodation they no longer need. So we need to continue to have those communications. Now, this is something that we need to tell our gen ed teachers, because they need to be able to communicate with you when an accommodation is not being used, when the student has not been needing it. They need to tell you what they're observing so that you know what the student is using and not using, or what is working or not working for that student, and whether we need to have a meeting during the year and talk about taking something out or adding something in. And the next thing we want to talk about is being able to collaborate and communicate. Collaborating with individuals to learn more. And that could be a whole lot of people here, right? It depends on who you need to talk to about what. So we could talk to the student. That's, of course, our first priority, is to make sure that we are on the same page with our student and they're on the same page with us. We need to make sure that we're discussing these things with families so that they feel confident in knowing what's happening and why. The special ed teacher, see, this list is for our gen ed teachers, right? Like, we put you on here. We told them, y'all need to be talking to your special ed teachers. The speech language person or related service provider, those are important people that they need to talk to as well. Particularly, a lot of times that AT equipment comes from a related service provider. They need to be able to communicate with those and know that it's okay to ask questions of them too. The school psychologist, especially if you're really trying to understand the student's disability and where their gaps truly are, they're the ones that are going to be able to really delve into those assessments and talk about what really happens there. The school counselor, school leaders, and even your district special ed supervisors, I encourage communication with district leadership. And I think that's a very important thing for us to feel comfortable with. And we also want to make sure that we're a continuous learner, that we attend trainings on accommodations to understand them, reading professional journals, or using reputable websites. Now, continuous learning, I think one of the things that we've talked a lot about with districts lately, particularly like I've talked about with my network, is that they've realized that our special ed and our gen ed teachers need to be going to the same trainings so that we're all on the same page. So we've talked about how our special ed teachers are now going to the curriculum trainings along with our gen ed teachers. We've talked about how if we're going to offer something like this training that I did here, this PowerPoint, I actually did this as a training in schools. And it wasn't just for the gen ed teachers. The special ed teachers were in that class right along with them. So those conversations were happening right then and there. So the more often that we can have our special ed and gen ed teachers doing the same training together, the better we learn and the better we communicate with each other. And I see some people writing, so I'm going to leave that up for a second. You guys do have access to these PowerPoints, so if for some reason you missed something during this, then make sure you go back and check that out. All right. Again, I'm going to talk about this effectiveness accommodations. Again, when we're talking about observing the student with those accommodations, throughout the year, we should be determining the effectiveness using data collection. Now, I know that feels like, oh my gosh, another piece of data. It could literally be just observational, right? Like every time a gen ed teacher notices that the student is not using their accommodations, they like have a little sheet that they're just like marking down like, hey, they didn't use this. Or they just shoot you an email and saying, hey, I've noticed this week that so-and-so is not using the accommodation, I am providing it. That's data collection, right? Just a quick observation of, are they using it consistently? Knowing that helps. So formative assessments given with and without an accommodation. So if you are thinking that a student has read aloud and maybe they're not using the read aloud, or it's not actually helping them because they don't truly need the read aloud, then you can do this. Your formative assessments. You still have to provide the accommodation because it's in the IEP. So you give it with the accommodation, but you also turn around and give it to them without, so you have a comparison. Okay? Now, if you do the without first, that's okay, but you still have to at some point give it with because it is required to do by the IEP. But you can do one without so you can compare. And if you do that multiple times, you'll have a set of data that shows you, is this actually changing the student's score? So if the student is scoring the same with and without the accommodation, do they need the accommodation anymore? That helps you talk to a parent around why they no longer need something, right? It's not just you saying, oh, they're not using it. It's, we gave this with and without the accommodation to see how they're doing without using it, and they're performing as well or better. So it's not really inappropriate when it's really a distraction for the student. Having that data makes it about the student's needs and not an emotional decision on the parent's part, because you've brought this to with a data collection piece. And that's that observation piece too. Asking if the accommodations is providing access. So this is where we can talk to parents around the fact that an accommodation is meant to reduce or mitigate the effects of the disability. It's meant to access the learning. And when we have that and we communicate that to our parents, it helps them understand why you're selecting what you're selecting and not just picking and choosing it like it's a nice little checklist of, oh, I want this and this and this, and like it's a grocery shopping list, you know? That's not what we want. We want to make sure it's meant to do its purpose. And we need to be able to define that to parents and explain that to them so they understand why we're making the decisions we're making. All right, brainstorming. Think about your district. Are there opportunities there already where your general and special ed attend professional development together? Or are there opportunities that you think might be available to you coming up? If that's the case, I want you guys to think about talking to your special ed supervisor, talking to your principal, and saying, hey, I'm trying to truly collaborate better and stronger with my gen ed teachers. Can I attend this alongside? It doesn't hurt to ask. you know? And it will offer that opportunity for you to make sure that you're all getting the same professional development and that you can have those stronger conversations. What supports might you offer to ensure that accommodations are implemented appropriately? Now, this is just, again, a brainstorm question for you guys to consider today, tomorrow, as you start the school year. What supports are you offering to ensure that those are implemented appropriately? Like we were talking earlier and we were discussing the fact that all the teachers might not have an opportunity to read all the IEPs, but maybe you do have an opportunity to meet with those teachers and not just hand them the IEP at a glance, but talk about them a little bit each. And if you can't do that, maybe putting on a Post-it note a clarification of that student and saying, hey, if you have any other questions, let me know, like I'm here to help. You know, and doing that is a support to our gen ed teachers to feel comfortable with this, as well as the fact that they might feel more comfortable reaching out down the road. So you guys are able to identify access points and scaffolds. You can differentiate between accommodation modifications. You can identify the appropriate use of accommodation. Y'all could do that before we even started. And you can incorporate accommodations into instruction. Of course, you guys could already do that anyways. But this is my email address. If for some reason you were interested in looking at like that unit and lesson prep protocol, it's on the Best for All Central website. But if you can't find it or you're struggling to, you guys can just shoot me an email and ask for that. I can send you that. I have it on my computer. Or if you have additional questions that maybe weren't part of this, but you just wanted to ask a question separately, or it's a more of an individual question, feel free to email me. I'm here to support you guys. And thank you guys for having me today. Oh, thank you. Yes, okay. So now we're going to do a Q&A and just open up the floor for questions. And again, we now are definitely going to be using our runners with the microphones. So please wait patiently until you get a microphone to ask a question. What questions do you guys have? Yes, ma'am. Oh, you mentioned you were going to have a question for me. I should have been prepared.
My question is, in middle and high school, there are times where you have a student who is substantially, they're in 8th grade and maybe they're at 5th grade learning level. So you're saying teaching them at 8th grade, but obviously that's not going to work initially. So how do you transition them from 5th grade, where they're currently at, to 8th grade by the end of the year?
So let me clarify, because when you just say 5th grade learning level, are we saying that that's where their skill sets are? Are we saying that that's where their reading level is? I mean, what are we talking about there?
Skill sets all over.
All of their skill sets are down there. So we still have to ensure that they're still accessing the same standards, but we might need to be breaking that down a little bit more, right? They might need to have a slower pace in their instruction for that. Or it might be that we ensure that we find access to the curriculum at a lower reading level. So one of the things I've talked about with my special ed supervisors when I've been doing this grant work with this network is that when I didn't realize they had done this until I went to do a textbook committee thing, and we got to see all these new textbooks, and I realized a lot of the curriculums offer an additional support work. Like they offer like what's called like a student workbook, but it's literally the textbook at a 3rd grade level. So I taught 8th grade. I taught 8th grade science at one point, and we had a new science curriculum. Well, I had students that were on 3rd grade reading level, but we had the workbooks, and those workbooks were the exact same content. It was just a 3rd grade reading level, and it even had all the same graphics, everything. It was literally the same thing, but it also gave them an opportunity to write in the book. It gave them an opportunity to highlight in the book. And so there are a lot of things out there that we're not even aware of that help provide access to the same standards that would still meet that student's needs with learning the same material.
Another question, and that is on reading. I know there's software out there. I don't know how many people use software. And is it by individual school choice, or is it something district-wide when you have like reading programs that can read to the kids, like for the read alouds and things like that?
That would be up to the district, and really a lot of the curriculums offer an online one where you can have that, and if not, there are a lot of just free programs out there. Microsoft has one that you can get through Google where it'll do that that read aloud, and in fact Microsoft, somebody showed it, and I wish I could remember what it's called, but they have one. It's basically their read aloud. That also, if the student doesn't know the word and you hover over it, it'll show you a picture of the word. And I love that. But if you have access to Microsoft, if your teachers have access to Microsoft, that's available to you in Microsoft Education. And so it really depends on what the district has as to what they have access to. But there are a lot of free things out there that can do that for them.
Okay, and I didn't know if people knew about Kurzweil as one, because I use that in the classroom in middle school. And in high school, when a student had a read aloud, they stayed in the classroom. They just had their headset on, and they could do the exact same activity and assessments that the class was doing because they get it.
Exactly. The technology has just come leaps and bounds and has really provided a way for us to have better access in the gen ed classroom without disrupting and having those students in there and being able to do that. And I love that. That's exciting stuff. All right. Any other questions? Y'all got nothing for me? Seriously? Okay. All right. Going once, going twice? Oh. Not a question, just a comment. Oh, okay.
I currently teach here at MTSU. So I wanted to talk about when the students come after high school to the university. We have a fantastic department for students with disabilities, all types. And I'm talking mental health, I'm talking physical. So a lot of times students, when they go from high school to college, they don't understand. They can bring those with them. And all we need is the documentation that they had in high school for them to be able to use them. And here, the initials are DAC for Disability Access Center. And they can take classes online as well as face-to-face. And I have had students in my classroom, one young lady who required a break whenever she felt like she needed one and she could get up and walk out of the class. And most of the time she was fine, but there were a couple times where every 10 minutes she was leaving during an hour and a half class. And she'd leave for a minute and she'd come back in. And she was situated near the door intentionally so that that was not disruptive to anybody. And I said, when you're in college, we treat you like an adult. You don't ask permission to go get a drink. You don't ask permission to go use the bathroom. It's not like you're in school. And I said, so if you have a need, get up and go do it. So nobody's going to care why you're leaving. No one's going to go, oh, how come they're leaving? They didn't ask to go to the bathroom. That kind of stuff. And then wheelchair access is a common one. We also have autistic students, and those are all in our gen ed classrooms. They don't have special classrooms. But if they were given the appropriate training and skills when they were in middle and high school, they usually function well. But we also have tutoring centers for all students who are struggling in any subject. And then the Disability Center also for testing. If someone requires extended time on testing, they are happy to have the student come there and complete the test if the teacher doesn't have other accommodations. And for me, I always encourage my students, I said, I would like for you to stay in the classroom because if you have a question, they're not going to know the answer. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you're welcome to go to the Disability Center. And if you need extended time, I teach reading here at the university. So we have a reading lab, which I can send them and they can have a quiet time to study afterwards if they need that extended time.
Okay, so this year with testing, and I'm at a high school, we had on the students' IEPs that they needed additional time for testing. So for like the TCAP testing we did, so, or EOC testing. And then when we got the manuals and we read through them, and a general education child could ask for extended time. And so some of my special ed teachers were like, why are we putting extended time on here and these kids are being pulled out and they don't want to be pulled out away from their peers. All they have to do is raise their hand. And in the script, I forget exactly what it said, but you know, on the reading test, you can have 10 extra minutes or something like that. And almost every group I had there was at least one child, 2 children, the most I had one time was 7, that raised their hand that they needed extra time. And the rest of the kids were very respectful and all that. But how, going forward, do you have any guidance on this? Can you talk to this?
So let me, and I can't do a lot of clarification on that, but we do have a special, excuse me, a special education assessment coordinator. Her name is Nancy Williams, and she works with the department. She's the one that creates those accommodation accessibility manuals that you guys get. And so if you have specific questions around the assessment accommodations, please reach out to her, because she's a dear friend of mine. I know she knows what she's talking about there. But I will say, if it's something where it's already offered with Gen Ed, like that, you're saying there's a limit of what the Gen Ed can get, right? It's 10 minutes. If that's the case, if you know that student can do it within the 10 minutes, and they don't necessarily need something beyond that, then that's not something you have to add to the IEP, because it's something that you can already access general ed-wise. However, with the students with disabilities with an IEP, you can have a little bit further extended time than 10 minutes, correct? So if they need more than 10 minutes, then we absolutely have to put it in the IEP. And so that's where you guys have to know what your accommodations opportunities, know what is offered to Gen Ed, and also know what you have the opportunity of with special ed. And as a team, you need to determine, does the student need more than what's already offered with Gen Ed, and it needs to be in the IEP, or not?
So this would be for the classroom setting, you would have it for that set of accommodations. But I'm thinking the next page on the IEP, you don't have to have no testing. Okay.
Because I've had some people that are very confused by this. Let me clarify here. You have to have it as a classroom accommodation if you want it on a testing accommodation. However, it does not work vice versa. You don't have to have it in a class. You don't have to have a classroom you don't have to have a testing accommodation just because you have it in the classroom, right? Because there are a lot of classroom accommodations we offer that we can't even offer with testing. So yes, it doesn't go both ways, but if you are adding a testing accommodation, it has to be something you're already providing in the classroom, but not vice versa.
Thank you, Ms. Chambers, for a really packed, informative presentation. Thank you very much.